So hello, everybody. Welcome to the International Macrohistory Seminar. I'm very glad to introduce you today to Felipe Valencia Caicedo. He is assistant professor at the University of British Columbia, and he is going to present today his joint research with Giorgio Ciovelli, Leopoldo Ferguson, Luis Martinez, Juan David Torres, Bourbon reforms and state capacity in the Spanish Empire. So before starting, I'm going to remind you the rules of the game. We have around 40 minutes for the presentation. During the presentation, if you have clarification questions, please ask them in the Q&A box. So I will stop Felipe during the presentation to ask for the clarification questions if it is needed. And then after the presentation, we will have 20 minutes for the discussion. And after the formal discussion, we will have another 15 minutes. It's an optional extra time we are going to have to continue with the discussion for those who wish to continue with this extra 15 minutes. So now we are going to start with the seminar. So Felipe, the floor is yours. So thank you very much, and you can start whenever you want.
Okay, so thank you so much, Pilar, for chairing and for the introduction. Thanks so much, Rui and Nathan, for inviting us. As Pilar was saying, this is joint work with Giorgio Ciovelli, Leopoldo Ferguson, Juan Roberto Martinez, and Juan David Torres. So I guess it's a big team. It's a big data project. So I'm very excited to show you what we have so far, and this is obviously work in progress. So your comments are most welcome. So let me just start with the big motivation for this project, which is essentially state capacity, which is a big and probably problematic concept. But here we're kind of trying to stick to the original Besley and Person definition. So in that definition, it essentially boils down to fiscal capacity. So in our general view of state capacity, fiscal capacity is central, and 85% of the paper is going to be really fiscal capacity with granular fiscal data, and to see how these work in a colonial context. At the same time, there's a growing interest in the role of administration and administrative reforms, kind of bureaucracies, broadly speaking. So the state, at the end of the day, boils down to some bureaucrats, and we're trying to examine how they do historically. Most of this research, and we had a masterful presentation by Davide Cantoni last seminar here, focuses on Western Europe and has this very strong Tilly view, right? Like the war and the state kind of in this recurrent circle. And we think that that's not exactly the view that would have external validity in a colonial setting. So for instance, what are the role of inclusive political institutions? What about if you have a very large territory that potentially you can't even control? What about state building from the outside? So all of these big motivating questions led us to study one which we think is the cornerstone reform in the Spanish Empire, which is the transition from the Habsburg to the Bourbon rule. So the famous Bourbon reforms. And part of that system of reforms that I'm going to tell you a bit more later on is the introduction of this intendancy or intendencias system at the late 18th century. So we want to see how this administrative reform that was big, large scale is going to have an impact or not on fiscal capacity. So in order to do that, we want to study what happened with these intendants, what are their characteristics, kind of like the more nitty-gritty, the mechanisms of transmission, so to speak. And this is a big data set, and we at the end are going to extend it even more to broaden our definition of state capacity from fiscal to legal capacity, and then also to think a little bit about like this very more modern framing of state capacity a la Person Econometrica 2020, of also thinking about constituencies. So what about reciprocity? So what about not only legal capacity, but like this kind of narrow corridor between the citizenry and the state? And for that, we're going to introduce extra data on historical names and talk a little bit, if there's time, about persistence and how we can see that even today. This is the typical staggered adoption of a reform, even though it's in the 1780s. We're going to have some variation, 83, 85, 87. So obviously, it's also the matter of heated econometric debate about how to do these things. So all of those fun new estimators are something that we are concerned about, or not concerned, but happy to show you in this paper as well. Okay, so just a preview of the results. It's a short presentation, but just so that you know where I'm going. These intendants led to more or less 30% increase in total revenue. So this is big. And we think of this kind of as a centralization reform, and it's going to be interesting because it's kind of a centralization and a decentralization. So there's going to be two layers, and there's a new bureaucracy, and I'm going to explain to you how that works a bit later. And then we're going to go to why did this work? So for instance, when are incentives aligned? So we're very much aware of the political economy of this reform. And when is it that, okay, even though you have this reform, is it working or not? And then kind of like show you what are the smaller consequences of this in terms of not only the big fiscal capacity, but how was this actually enacted. We also find that these intendants led to a reduction in acts of rebellion, so a bit of the broader law and order view. But at the same time, this was not all rosy. Of course, we have independence in the 1810s and 20s in Latin America. So you also start seeing kind of like the seeds of the destruction of the regime, kind of with dissent from the Spanish crown amongst the general population. I'm going to show you some cool way that we try to do that with the data. And if there's time, as I said before, maybe, okay, but what about in the very long term? How are we seeing any effects of these or not? Okay, so big literature, I think we're contributing to this big state capacity literature. So what are the origins of the state? Tilly, generally involved, obviously the work of Besley Person that I mentioned before. There's always kind of like this threat of war. Here we have a reform again that talks about fiscal centralization, but decentralization in some other areas. We talk a little bit more about like the political institutions behind this. There are some papers that have looked at kind of colonial bureaucracies in the past, for instance, the work of Guoshu. And so here we are again looking at a comprehensive institutional reform throughout the Spanish Empire. So this is going to cover from Mexico to Chile, which is obviously a huge territory, and we want to like look at potentially the most important set of reforms that happened during the colonial regime in the Hispanic Americas. We are obviously contributing to a very rich history of royal treasuries and Bourbon reforms. The first person to look at this data was Alexander von Humboldt when he wrote the history of New Spain, the history of Mexico. But rich tradition, people like Lynch, Navarro Garcia, etc. I mean, there's a lot that has been written and studied about this. Most famously Klein and Tepasque. And I think that here we are kind of like building on the shoulder of these giants and just putting like this spin of some econometric techniques and to kind of like see what happened. And obviously, I think we are also talking, even though this is more of a history seminar, to a very modern literature, like how do you build a state? What's state capacity? How do you deal with bureaucracy? So the work of people like Jonathan Weigel, Pedro Albor, Raul Sanchez de la Sierra, that are thinking like, oh, how do you start a new tax collection system? So we can also talk to that extremely modern and recent fiscal literature. Okay, so obviously it's a history paper and a history talk. So let me start with that right away with the historical background. So this is just to, I guess, the big context here. This is a massive empire, right? From California to Patagonia, it's divided into viceroyalties. Those viceroyalties in turn are divided into audiencias and capitanías. And at the very local level, kind of, you can think of these essentially as a tax farming institution in the European context. You have these encomenderos and corregidores, so people that are kind of like privately collecting taxes, and kind of at the same time, we have a colonial fiscal apparatus mostly constituted by these royal treasuries, cajas reales, established in 1501 and mostly located in administrative centers, ports, mines, etc., like a lot of controls that we might want to include. And they are consolidating and redistributing revenue across the empire. They have strong monitoring by the crown, including the data that we have, which is essentially the one that we're using, and that was kind of like secret at the time and mostly for the royal eyes. So the Bourbon reforms, I've talked enough about them. Let me just give you a sense of what they are. It's part of this big transition from Habsburg to Bourbon rule. So the kind of the French dynasty taking over Spain. The early reforms are territorial change. So the establishment of the new viceroyalties of Nueva Granada, Rio de la Plata. People like Jenny Guardado have studied the sale of colonial offices in this context. Because of the threat, I mean, this again, the Tilly view of the threat of war, the British captured Havana in 1762, and this led to this big reform under Carlos III, Charles III, of raising revenue, strengthening defense, and this leads, among others, to trade liberalization. There's a beautiful new paper by Sebastian Ellingsen, a job market paper, looking at trade. Here we're focusing on that more fiscal part, which are the intendants that I'm going to show you in a second. So that's essentially led by this guy, Jose de Galvez, that you're going to see in a second, of saying, okay, how can we overhaul the empire with these intendants to solve the agency issues of the old corregidores, to get more revenue, and essentially at the end also to promote kind of like law and order. So very much fiscal, but also a little bit of like a law and order that we're also going to look at. So there's these intendants, they're coming from France, then they're going to Spain, and then they're going to the Americas. They're replacing these corregidores, and they're again promoting kind of like quote unquote local welfare, which just means taking more taxes from the population, and again kind of establishing peace, law and order. A careful selection process, so they're better paid. I'm going to show you a graph of that in a second. An indefinite term, and the implementation of the reform, again very much tied to the life and fate of Galvez, gives us this staggered adoption. So I mean, there are some ordinances that say this reform must be done, but then there is some staggered adoption of the reform. So these intendants, here you can see, I don't know if you can see my clicker, these intendants are earning more than the existing corregidores, than the existing encomenderos. They're better paid. They are kind of in charge of, historically they were in charge of legal duties and fiscal duties. And now you're going to have a new system that is much more professional. You don't need, quote unquote, to exploit the population in a context where you had low wages that led to all sorts of corruption. So, I mean, if you read Lynch's classical treatise on this, he says like these corregidores are the very archetype of corruption and erring officialdom. So this is all replaced or largely replaced by the new intendants. So let me show you, and again, it's a short presentation, so I need to keep moving, but happy to expand on the chat in the history. Let me show you what we actually have here. Essentially, it's an economic history contribution, meaning data contribution. The huge effort was done already by the Spanish Empire, which was taking care in painstaking detail of what are kind of like all the tax flows in and out of the empire and in and out of these royal treasuries for hundreds of years. Let me just kind of like give you a sense of the time dimension here. So these are the different royal treasuries. And we have kind of like from the 1500s until essentially independence. So in rich detail, we also have thousands of categories to analyze. So here, just to give you a sense of the tax dimension, these are the number of different budget lines that we have. And again, in the hundreds, of course, we need to aggregate this into some meaningful categories, but it's just to show you the richness of the data. So I think that most of that was already done in the Spanish Empire. Then the huge contribution of Tepazque and Klein of consolidating all these, and essentially a lifetime's work of doing that. And our smaller contribution, which is just to, use that data, clean it, digitize whatever was not digitized, and complemented with other parts that, even though Tepaskian claimed Herculean efforts, were missing, most notably Nueva Granada, so the area of nowadays Colombia, and just kind of like clean and consolidate everything. That's the brunt of the data set. Of course, we also care about the differential implementation of these reforms. So we have coded biographical data for all of the 85 intendants. So there are not that many. So we can go into the biographies and look at what they were doing, who they married, et cetera, et cetera. A lot of these treasury geographic characteristics, most of it based on the fantastic work of the HGIS de las Indias, HGIS of the Indies. We're going to have data on rebellions, data on names, which is going to be important at the end when we look at mechanisms, and some modern data on tax collection in what are former colonies to kind of like link it to today. So essentially, we're contributing with data. Of course, we're analyzing this data, but I think that it's going to be also a public good eventually of all of this data there. And I mean, we're carrying on our analysis, but hopefully also fostering other types of analysis with this fantastic data. Okay, so what we're actually exploiting is, as I've been saying before, this staggered adoption of the intendant system across the empire. So again, we have kind of from Mexico to Chile, and there is an ordinance that say, okay, now we're going to have intendants, but some places adopted later, some places adopted earlier. So you can see even yearly variations, 1783, 84, 86, and 87. So that's exactly what we're going to implement in a more staggered adoption, diff in diff type of framework. And you might be worried, why were they not adopted? So we've consolidated also a big data set on the more geographic weather characteristics and so historical variables, just to say, when are these places adopted? And we don't find much change of like some of these observables driving it, especially for these late adopters. And of course, we're going to include all of these characteristics also as controls, but it's just kind of like to preempt, like, why are they adopted or not? So that's essentially taken care of, at least this way. Then let me just kind of walk you through the richness of the data before running any empirics. So this is when more or less there's the ordinance, 1783, and this is revenue in millions of pesos. So you can kind of see the evolution, and it's not like a pre-post, but I guess if you took the average here and an average here, you would already like see that something is going on. We also, as I said, have detailed data. I'm going to show you that later. Also, how is this spent? So on the expenditure side, again, you can potentially already see that there's kind of a low regime and a high regime. No, econometrics is just like to get you the visuals and the richness of the data. And on net, we also see an increase in surplus or superávit. And again, I think here it's kind of clear some pre and post. So there seems to be, at least if you just look at this data, that there might be something there going on around the 1783 or so in terms of what's happening with tax collection. So of course, only descriptives, but just kind of like to walk you through how this looks. We can also just say, okay, what about like treated treasuries and never treated treasuries? And more or less, as I said, they start being implemented in 1783, finish in 1787. And you see again, kind of some sort of parallel trends and some divergence. And we can also do these kind of in a more synthetic control approach. Let me see if I can just show you here of like essentially some synthetic control and eventual divergence. In this case, for instance, with Nueva Granada, what today is Colombia. So again, no fancy econometrics, just kind of like a way to understand and see the data. What we actually want to run here is the standard diff in diff. So now we're going to have kind of like the whole machinery with treasury year fixed effect. So we're going to have an outcome in a royal treasury I in year T, for instance, or most notably log revenue. We're going to control for a bunch of characteristics, most of the geographic variables that I showed you before. And we're interested in whether this staggered adoption of the intendencia system is going to generate more revenue or not. Okay, so we're interested essentially in this beta. We have different ways of clustering the standard errors. Probably the most conservative is by treasury. So we have kind of like 80 clusters, but we've played quite a lot also with the error structure here. So standard diff in diff. So without further ado, just let me show you the classic RD diff in diff graph, which is the following. So we see kind of parallel pre-trends. So, and again, this is where a lot of the literature is now saying, well, it depends on the negative weights, all that. I'm going to show you that in a second, but just the normal standard diff in diff that you're used to shows essentially no pre-trends. And with the staggered implementation of these reforms, so it's going to turn into one for Mexico at a different time period that when it turns to one for the Rio de la Plata, vice royalties, and even treasuries, we see kind of like these significant increase, okay? I'll answer the Q&As at the end, so, but feel free if there's something that is not clear, also happy to clarify it as we go along. Okay, so that was kind of like just the picture. Here is the actual number, so it's more or less, and this is where we get this number of the 30% of the effect of the adoption of this intendencia system on log revenue, because it's kind of the typical setup of something that it's announced and then it's actually implemented. Let me just show you quickly that indeed is when the de facto implementation of this intendencia happens, the one that is having the effect, more than just the announcement of eventually we're going to have this intendencia system. And again, I guess this squares back to the idea that this is a big, complicated empire that we want to, that the Spaniards are ruling from very far away. Okay, so now all of these new methods. So again, this is staggered adoption. So essentially you have municipalities or treasuries that are treated in one time period that are going to be different to the newly treated. So is the classic scenario for this staggered diff in diff potential problems. We've done as much as we can playing with all of these new estimators. So the Chase-Martin one gives you an overall beta, of course, a lot more conservative of 15%, but you can see here kind of like surviving that and like which are the key years. Similar for this Callaway and Santana. And I mean, it seems like every week there is one of these new estimators. So let me just show you kind of like how it looks for all of them here. So the Borussia, Chase-Martin, Callaway, Son Abram. So you see, I mean, of course, with some different standard errors, but also including there the OLS for comparison, that essentially there's not much in terms of pre-trends. And then we see an increase. I mean, of course, here we're just bunching all of these estimators, but I think that you get the sense that this is potentially robust to this estimation, even though, of course, we're using 1780s data, but we can still use the granularity of the year in which this was implemented. Okay, so this is kind of like the more high-tech econometrics. And let me just show you kind of like the good old of like what we can do. We can also drop treasuries. So maybe you're worried that one particular treasury is driving it. It doesn't seem to be the case. We can even drop whole intendencia. So kind of like just the structure. I don't know if that was clear from before, but there's an intendencia. Some of them have more than one treasury. So we can even drop whole intendencias and it doesn't seem to affect the results. We can even drop whole vice royalties. So that's what we do here at the end. So you see that also it doesn't seem to affect the results, or it's not entirely driven by one vice royalty. Oh, this is New Mexico, this is Peru. And it doesn't seem to be the case. Okay, so that's just kind of to show you that, of course, we can run stuff with viceroy fixed effects. Of course, we can also show that it survives the controlling for rebellions, et cetera, et cetera. But let me just move to potentially more interesting things than the robustness. Okay, and that's the mechanism. So I don't know if mechanisms is the right word, but it's just how did this come about and why did this work? And kind of like to try to understand, okay, maybe like there's this big ballpark figure, 30%, but how did this come about and work? So that's essentially what I want to show you next. Let me first kind of like summarize things, and then maybe if there's time, kind of show you some of the key results. But it's essentially an increase in fiscal capacity, taking taxes out where the state was absent. So the first thing is just going to be state presence. So let me actually show you that one right away. So distance to the intendencia capital much shorter than the vice royalty capital than the audiencia capital. So the state is closer to you. In that sense, in a way, I mean, that's where we talk about centralization, decentralization. It's a decentralization of the state with respect to the vice royalties and the audiencias. Of course, it's a centralization of the state with respect to the very bottom-up tax farming techniques that were there before. But the thing is that the state now is closer to you. But also we find nice effects, I'm going to show you those later, of previously isolated low fiscal capacity areas and actually non-traditional revenue treasuries. So this is not acting in Bogota, Quito, Buenos Aires, Mexico City. This is more the quote unquote provinces. So this is like the second, the third tier provinces of these places where there was still a lot to collect in terms of taxes, but they were not the main capitals. They're also not the most isolated areas, okay? Also, what we see as a shift towards direct taxation. Obviously, there's no direct taxation at the time, but the beginning of things like these donativos, and I mean, I'll show you again the results in 1 second, but this shift towards different taxation and not just the usual trade taxes, not just the usual indigenous taxation that you had before, led to increasing tax complexity. Again, I'm going to try to walk you through these results in a minute. Just want to give you the general overview. And in a way, it's also a disruption of this local elite capture. So here's where the political economy is very important. So why would this work? Maybe you're just co-opting the system. Yeah, but I mean, there's going to be different interests at play. So we show that the peninsular intendants that are more aligned with the crown, that's where the action is happening. Also, we also see some learning by doing. So you get better at the job as time progresses. These elements lead to reshuffling of royal treasuries without changing in reporting practices. If anything, they become a little bit better, but we've done a lot of exercises there, also kind of a more econometric forensics to look at these, reduced tax collection expenses, and then it increases expenditures without incurring in the deficit. So this is a mouthful, but I just wanted to kind of like give you a broad overview of where I'm going next, and then just kind of like highlight some of the results as we go along. So this one I showed you, just kind of like the centralization, decentralization measure. In this case, the state is closer to you. This one, which is just kind of like showing you that the effects are not these major capitals, is not the archdiocese, it's more the dioceses, okay? So it's not the audiencia capital, it's kind of like the next part, like the provinces. And again, just to stress the fact that this is after the revolution in trade. So this is not about trade, like again, Elixon's paper that it's really about trade. Doesn't seem to be that. It's not about mining. It's really just more about like these other provincial areas and capitals. And again, we see that here kind of, and it works best in places that were not getting that much fiscal capacity before. So low fiscal capacity places, think of these as kind of exploiting or taking advantage in places that still had like a cushion to grow. And it's not, again, in the extremely remote areas. These are close to the intendencia capitals. So, I mean, it's close to the provincial capitals. It's not like the most far away corners of the empire. So that's where we think it's like this middle ground between the very far away and the big capitals in colonial times. Decreased reliance on some of these traditional sources, more shifts toward these quote unquote direct taxation. Of course, there's no direct taxation back then, but kind of like just to show you that it's not the more traditional sources of revenue. And these, again, I mean, we have 7,000 budget lines. So we are having different ways of like how to consolidate these. This is the traditional Tepazquian claim consolidation, and we are also working with others. And also, I mean, I guess this is just kind of a descriptive of these, but you can see that in a way there is more increased tax complexity. So again, these are hundreds of these budget lines, and you can see both in income and expenditure that indeed there is more tax complexity as the reform kicks in. Okay, so again, just a descriptive, but just to show you of the thousands of budget lines that are active and that we can keep track over time, again, given the richness of the data. And it has, so now moving more towards the characteristic, it has a larger impact for the Spanish intendants. So again, maybe this alignment with the crown, are you peninsular or not? And I'm gonna expand on this at the end. Less on these former corregidores. So if these people before were a corregidor, a governor somewhere, that's not where this reform is working best. So it's mostly like these newly arrived Spaniards. Of course, there could also be some resentment there, which we're gonna look later on. And I mean, eventually we end up in independence. So clearly this was not very well taken at the end of the empire. And also this learning by doing. So there is turnover that suggests positive returns to experience. So after 5-6 years, you get better at the job. Okay, but this is just kind of the learning by doing. So there's a selection part, and then this is just kind of like the treatment part of you get better at the job. As I was hinting at before, most of the paper is on collecting taxes, revenue, but we also find that this money is spent. So expenditure increases in treated treasuries after the introduction of the reform. There is no deficit. I mean, I'm not going to show you all the buttons, but essentially there's an increase also in expenditure. So you might be wondering, how is this spent? And we find that, I mean, there's still a kind of additional revenue. It's spent more, but it's not necessarily in tax collection. So we kind of start to think a little bit about, okay, maybe you're becoming more efficient at getting taxes. And that's, again, we have 7,000 lines of budget that we can like reorganize and reshuffle in different ways to think about, is this investment? Is these different types? Like, how is this money spent? And again, we're just kind of being straight here with the Tepasque and Klein classifications, but we can show you additional ones for now. I'm skipping them in the interest of time. Okay, so let me now, even though it's mostly, as I promised at the beginning, this fiscal, classic Besley person, think a bit more broadly, because state capacity is not only fiscal capacity, and even the Besley person framework gives you this idea of, okay, it's not only the fiscal part, but also the legal capacity, protection of property rights, law and order, if you want to put it in those terms. So there is kind of like this tension of rebellions, indigenous rebellions. Actually, the Tupac Amaru rebellion is against the antique corregidores. And part of the way that this reform is solved is like, well, now we're going to have these intendants that are not going to exploit the population that much, at least in these traditional indigenous areas. And that's one way to like sell things. But you might wonder, okay, maybe like people are also rebelling and not liking this too much. So we've consolidated, again, a continental database on conflict to look at this from different sources, the HGIS of the Indies, but also Taylor, Golte, Ophelan, like different books. And we again, not only want to look at the fiscal part, but also want to look at this law and order, legal part. And we find that indeed, after the introduction of these intendency system, these rebellions against the crown decreases. This might not necessarily be that people are so happy, but is that you have a stronger state that is also quelling these rebellions. But again, it's very much this law and order. These intendants are going to go there, are going to raise more revenue, get more taxes, but also kind of like promote, quote unquote, peace, which means order. Okay, so we see a bit of that here. But then also you might think what happens in the longer term. And there I'm going to integrate also like how the population feels, but show you kind of like what is kind of the aftermath of these rebellions. And if there's time, which I think there might be, to show you the very long run, which is something that's a bit more preliminary, but just to kind of like get an idea of what we have there. Okay, so the first thing is, after the 1800s, where we stop our previous analysis, the availability data, the fiscal data is less and less available, right? So you have kind of like full compliance, and then just less and less of these royal treasuries are reporting, maybe misreporting, maybe independence. Here we have kind of like the key events of independence, so that at the end, I mean, essentially there's no more Spanish empire. So who are you going to report these royal treasuries? Nobody. Okay. Of course, there's a big debate in the literature also of continuity and change, that after independence, a lot of these fiscal structures also remain, but clearly they're not reporting to the king. And this is the data that we have. So there's clearly a reduction in fiscal availability. But if you were to push the data the farthest. Was there a collapse during the independence era? Not really. I mean, it seems just to like stabilize at a high level. I mean, of course, again, just mind the fact that we might be losing some treasuries here. So we've played a lot of like just keeping the ones that I'll always report or not. But you can see kind of like in the longer horizon, and of course, there's increasing noise at the end. And there seems to be kind of like a positive effect. So at least it's not dying out. And again, for a one-off reform, we think that this is pretty long-lived. But what about this other tension that it's kind of like emerging from, okay, now you're putting a lot of these Spaniards and that's fine to get more taxes, but wouldn't this increase also tension? So you have great data of the composition of the audiencia, so more the legal judiciary side. And there you see that the share of Creoles collapses after 1770 and increases massively for Spaniards, okay? So at the end, during the Bourbon period, at the end of the Hispanic Empire of the Americas, there is more and more Spaniards controlling the key positions of power. No surprise, that's exactly what the Creoles don't want, exactly what like Bolivar and others write about and fight about. So you also see a share of these Spanish intendants increasing over time, okay? So fine, great, you're getting more money, maybe the interests are aligned, but maybe you're also kind of like generating tensions with the population. And that's exactly what we try to capture with this data set. So here we have almost 1 million names from the 1770s to the 1800s of all of the names of everyone that was born in the Americas at the time, okay? So it's huge database, again, from the Patagonia to the Rio Grande. And then we look at Spaniard affinity. And the way that we do here is with viceroy and intendants names. So before, maybe it was very cool to put the name of the king. I guess Felipe is a good example now. And now it's not cool anymore, because before we were all happy with the crown. And now, kind of as a sign of discontent, we are putting less names that are viceroys or intendants or only viceroys after the passing of the reform. So there's kind of like this immediate thing of like, I mean, it's not voting with your feet, it's like voting with your baptismal record in a way, of less names that are kind of like consonant with the crown. Okay, and we've played a lot with these, of what about excluding the most common names? What about only the former viceroys? What about the contemporary viceroys? What about the intendants? What about both of them, et cetera, et cetera? But in general, we do see kind of like this average effect on decreased Spaniard affinity. I mean, it's very visually clear here, but also to give you a sense of the numbers here, around 10%, okay? So yes, all of this reform is so good, but I mean, of course it led towards independence, so people are not happy about this. And this is what we want to capture here. And then in the remaining minute or so, again, this is preliminary, but we're quite excited about this. What about the extremely long term? What about like tax collection today? So this was a lot of effort, like just to get this data set. So this is modern times, municipality level. So you see all the dots of how this corresponds to today's municipalities. Actually, just consolidating this one cross section has been huge work, just to kind of like give you a sense of how incredible is the work of having done these for hundreds of years and for so many budget lines. This is just tax revenue and transfers. And so we're interested here kind of like looking at persistence, but persistence within taxation, which is, okay, let me just focus here on tax revenue. So the farther you are from this nearest royal treasury, the less you collect. So there seems to be some persistence in the sense that like these places are collecting more. Of course, a potential endogeneity there could be huge, and we just try to control for a bunch of things, but that's probably not enough. But also these heterogeneity. So what about places that collected more money? So kind of like you were, I don't know, squeezed more or had more revenue in the past. Actually, those places report less tax collection today. Okay, so this one is a distance too, so farther away, less collection, so more collection in the royal treasuries, but also less collection if you were kind of quote unquote exploited more. So maybe fine, you got more taxes back then, but maybe there's also this thing of like, okay, in the long term, we really didn't like that. Clearly, we didn't like that. given independence. So what about like the modern part? So again, we're still kind of finishing the last touches of this very, very modern part, but we're excited to try to tie the past and the present in fiscal matters with this new data set. But I just wanted to kind of like put it out there and show you what we're working on. So let me just conclude in the interest of time to be on time. So here we study the impact of potentially the most ambitious effort of administrative colonial reform, at least in the Hispanic Americas. And what's the impact of that on state capacity? As I said before, we're really kind of like centering on fiscal capacity, which is the rich tax data that we have. And we find a positive effect. And we find also that kind of how is this working? Well, in a way, it's changing the selection issues that there were before with the corregidores. Is changing the incentives. If you think about the peninsulars versus the non-peninsulars, the Creoles, and it led to increased revenue and decreased conflict. So kind of like this expansion of the state capacity view also to include legal capacity, quote unquote, law and order. The reforms strengthened state presence in places that where the state was not very powerful before. Again, not the big colonial capitals, but kind of like the next frontier, kind of like the provinces, but also not the very far away provinces, just kind of like not Bogota, not Santiago, not Lima, but the next. And even though we find that these indigenous rebellions decrease, this tension with potentially the Creole elites may have increased. So I showed you that kind of in the audiencia selection, in the intendancy selection, but even in the overall population with names. So less affinity or less Spaniard affinity with names, and some evidence, I guess, of fiscal persistence with some heterogeneous effects. So I'm gonna leave it at that, close there to be exactly on time. And of course, happy to take any questions. Pilar, I don't know what you've seen in the chat, and I think some of my co-authors are also joining. So happy to keep the discussion going, and also happy to stay informally for the extra 15 minutes. Thank you so much for your attention.
Thank you very much for this wonderful and very, very clear presentation. So we are going to start now with questions. So please write your questions in the Q&A box. So to start, we already have one question. So it's Gustavo Leiva, and he says, what would be another suspect behind those results? He refers to the increase in total revenue. So he said, besides state capacity, is state capacity the only one?
Yeah, so I guess this was asked before the mechanism. So again, we use this big word state capacity, and indeed kind of like the state is closer to you. But clearly that's not the only thing, right? Like we have many reforms in Latin American history, and some work, some don't. So I think that most of what the mechanisms were trying to show or trying to expand on is, okay, maybe it's not only the state is closer, but is there an alignment with the people that are actually implementing these reforms? And to a certain extent, yes. I mean, these people are more Spanish, and maybe the alignment there is higher with the crown. So it's not only like the state is closer, but I think also the nitty-gritty political economy implementation of the reforms. Having said that, I guess one could counter critique and say, yeah, but I mean, being Spanish is not enough. So something that we're expanding on right now is to look at this database of the Actos database of actual actions. So who are you marrying with? Who are you baptizing? Who is your family marrying with? So just kind of like to have a better measure of potential political allegiance. So I guess, yeah, Gustavo, this was probably before the mechanisms, but I guess that'll be one way to summarize what we saw in the mechanisms. And thanks for your question.
Thank you. So I'm going to take advantage of my position while people are thinking about questions, because I also have a few questions. So the first one is related to this change of, because you base your story in the role of intendancies. So it would be interesting to better understand which was the role of corregidores before.
Yeah.
because you define them as, well, you have said very, very fast, kind of tax farmers. It's not
Yeah.
so clear for me if because they were public servants.
Yeah.
So it's not so clear for me if we can define them as also a kind of administrative bureaucracy, but with higher agency problems.
Exactly.
So if this is the case, the story is to better understand why the fact of having these intendants who were Spanish changed these agency problems, right? So it's more
Yeah,
that
no, no.
than.
Totally. I mean, of course, you're an expert on this topic, so I was just kind of using a quick analogy of like, okay, if you have some European notion, this would be tax farming. Like, for instance, Nico Voigtlander work on that, but it's really not. You're totally right. So like now let's expand on the corregidores. This is something that we're also trying to do empirically. I just showed you the wages data before. No, this is not tax farming, as you say. Like this is just people that are employed in the bureaucracy at a lower level with huge agency problems. Let me just take the opportunity to quote John Lynch in full, essentially the best or one of the best accounts of the Spanish colonial administration in his classic book 58. The corregidor, the very archetype of Eric officialdom, whose repertoire included almost every device known in the history of administrative corruption, the farmed and unaccounted revenue, the holding of royal funds in deposit to be used as private capital, the forced Indian labor without pay, and above all, the notorious repartimiento or forced sale of merchandise at outrageous prices to the unfortunate natives. So it's just the worst form of exploitation. And clearly what led to the Tupac Amaru revolt rebellion was this. But yeah, you're totally right. And of course, in the paper that's in the making, we would expand on this and be very clear what we mean and what we don't mean. It's not tax farming. These are just extremely corrupt bureaucrats. Let me also mention on the more modern literature, the great work of Jenny Guardado on the sale of colonial offices, focusing on Peru, and that's very rich in political science and in history about this. So yeah, thanks a lot, Pilar, for the comment. Yeah, definitely something we should explain better in the paper. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you very much. Yes, mainly because the standard literature is about this change from tax farming to administrative bureaucracy. So yeah.
Okay.
So we have now more questions. Good. So here we have one, Angela Redis. What was the relative population size of indigenous and Creole population after the reforms? How burdensome were the taxes? I'm interested in the link to independence. Do you have evidence of direct links between the reforms and independence?
Yeah, I mean, fantastic questions, Angie. I'm not surprised. Thanks a lot for posting them. Stuff we're working on. So we started with these names as a general sentiment. We also thought that maybe the names would be useful to get a sense of population size at the more disaggregated level. It's hard, but at least some sense of the relative indigenous versus Creole we should get. And I mean, there's some estimates of that are credible, so we should definitely include that. I'm going to make a note of that. But we really want to use that link that you're saying, which is okay. Maybe it's not only now you have less Spanish sounding names. You don't want to put your kid the name of the corregidor or the viceroy or the new intendant. But what about actual battles? So one idea that we have is, given that we have the universe of names, is to see where there were the Simon Bolívars and where were the big leaders of independence born, and if that somehow correlates to these things. And the other work that we're doing, it's more of a history, economic history work of digitizing a lot of these letters of complaints to see if people are complaining a bit more about this, and this eventually leads to battles, independence, etc. So that's, I think, like the key final link of the paper. I mean, we could just finish the paper and say, oh, this reform was fantastic, 30% collection, but anyone that knows anything about Spanish colonial history would know that it essentially collapses and ends in 1810, 1820. So that's the final link that we want to make. I also know that Giorgio is there in the chat. I don't know if Giorgio wants to add anything on this question or any question. Feel free to interrupt or to add. I think there are more and more questions in the chat, but Pilar, you're the boss.
Yeah, we have more questions. So David Mitz, could you say more about the evolution over time of the underlying economic activity behind tax and the impact of tax collection mechanism on incentives of this activity? One tends to think of the Spanish Empire as being largely extractive, taking out bullion, for example. What about the structure of land owning and utilization, latifundia versus peasant production? Wouldn't latifundia owners be in a position to resist and evade tax collection measures? I'm wondering generally about whether incentives developed by the intendants to act more as stationary bandits in terms of promoting incentives for productivity in order to enhance tax collections. Related to this is the contracts often made by between Spanish and Portuguese colonization, emphasizing extraction versus British emphasizing productivity of new settlers.
So fantastic question, David. Nice to read you. I don't know if see you, if you're going to connect later. Very much on point. I think here that's kind of like the more macro things that are going on, right? Like the big Bourbon reorganization of the empire, of going more from one even type of empire to another. So there's still kind of like the differences with the British Empire in particular and the Portuguese that you mentioned. But this kind of desire to be, again, I'm simplifying a lot and there's hundreds of years of history here, but essentially become a little bit more like the Brits and really take a bit more. And of course, there's this view of like how extractive is it? So the great work of people like Irigoyen and Grafe of yes, but there's also some redistribution. And that's actually like a whole other project that we're thinking about doing, which is to think more about like your distribution among the empire, kind of like this Ellingsen view of the world of also there's a huge reorganization in trade. As we go along, and I think that you're exactly on point, well, there could also be incentives for these people to misbehave. And instead of just being the ugly corregidor and being the beautiful intendant, now you could also see corruption in the intendancy system for sure. I think it's just a relative corruption thing of before it was horrible, and then now maybe it's a little bit less bad. I think that's the capture, like that's the nitty gritty of the 83, 85, 87 that we're capturing. The broader idea of like the economic structures and how is Latin America or the Hispanic empire in Latin America kind of changing as you have independence, revolution, etc. It's very much in line with what you're saying, where all of these things like land tenure patterns, Engerman and Sokolov, but also capture of the elites, etc., were living, to be honest, until today. And so, I mean, I think it's not fair to your question just to close it in 3 minutes. This is obviously a nice long discussion I would love to have had with you in person, but yeah, exactly on. And I'm also potentially gonna copy all of these questions. I think there's another one by Nipe so that we can also discuss with co-authors. I think Giorgio is helping there in the chat as well, but back to you, Pilar.
Yeah, let's go to this question, and then Rui has also a couple of questions, but first Nipel, he said, this is just clarifying, might have missed it, but when you saw how tax revenue results depend on distances, how were those distances measured? It is just as the crow files or more complex with transport cost and so on.
Nipe, as simple as possible, just as the crow flies. These are just kind of our heterogeneous effects measure, and are you quote unquote close and far, which is obviously totally wrong or wrong to a large extent. We do have, because we have the HGIS project of the Indies, more ways to do this in a more sophisticated fashion with geography, with ruggedness, but also with like, is this a port or not? We are thinking about doing that. This one is just a heterogeneous effect where it's just like near far. So to answer to your question in plainly, But it's something that we're considering, maybe like a project that it's more about the geography of these royal treasuries. And then, as I was replying to David Mitch before, the potential redistribution from one place to another of these royal treasuries. So all stuff that we have in our actual data set that we haven't used yet. Thanks for the question. I think Giorgio is also typing something, so that's great. Oh, great to see Alejandra here, but back to Pilar.
Yeah, we have first Rui questions, and then we go with Alejandra. So,
Okay.
Rui, do you want to ask yourself?
Yeah, thank you. First of all, this is breathtaking. And, I've been noting questions, but you've been answering as you go along, because, of course, it looks like you thought of everything. So, but let me try a couple of ones. So picking up on what you've been calling redistribution, right? So we're talking about the situados, right? Yeah. So these inter-caja colonial transfers. And, of course, the specialist is with us, and maybe I'm a bit worried of asking the question in lieu of Alejandra, but she's next on the queue, so she can correct me. But what I know is that these transfers also increase after the Bourbon reforms, right? So it's not only that the reforms were aimed at raising more revenue, they also had a view where to spend it. Yeah. And that might generate a conflict with the local Creole elites, as you mentioned. But what I remember of Irigoyen and Grafe is that actually the local elites found a way of actually benefiting from these transfers. So I'm not so sure whether political economy, whether this indeed increased the political economic conflicts, or this was just another colonial settlement. Because something else that also happens is that the transfers to Spain from Spanish in America fall after the Bourbon reforms, right? Yeah. So more money was being raised, more money was being spent in America than it was before, perhaps not where it was being raised. So I would like to hear what are your thoughts on that. Then, I have two more fast ones. So an observation, right? So I guess correctly, you bring the heavy artillery of staggered diff and diff, but I wonder if a staggered treatment, staggered by no more than 4 years, actually is even worth investigating, right? So because it would take a while to build up even a minimum tax structure, right? So you just did a regular diff and diff. Would your results differ in any way? I mean, what? Yeah. I know that you have to do this for future referees' sake, but right, it's not like one part of the Spanish America got in the 1780s and the other in the 1790s. They all, the ones that got them in a very short period. Finally, there's a growing literature that says that in the early modern period, especially in the late part, tax reforms tended to be regressive, right? Even tax reforms raised or implemented to improve the discharge of public goods and services, they tend to be regressive. What do you know about this particular? This is not only a tax reform, I understand, but could it be that there's some there would also be some long-term effects on inequality?
Okay, so I mean, this is a lot. Let me start with the easiest one, and then go in increasing level of complexity. So the staggered on all of these like fireworks and all of these like new estimators, totally with you. Also works in the normal diff in diff. I think I showed you quickly like the graph, but also because it's a reform that it's announced and then implemented. That's the one I quickly flashed of. It's announced and then it's implemented. So of course we get like a nice extra kick of it's really 1783 and not 1785. But that's just kind of the very nitty gritty. You can also think about this, the big pre and the big post, and that's why I showed you the data before. So totally with you on that. Let me go to one that I think it's also part of the crux of the matter that obviously Alejandra is also putting in the chat, and we can continue the discussion later if you want. Transfers are the crux of the matter here. In a way, we've tried to do many things. The most awful one is to completely delete anything that is transferred. Okay, so first let me just the background for people that maybe don't know all the nitty gritty of these royal treasury accounts. Yes, so it's not only from Alejandra's and Grafe's work, it's not only that you're collecting more, but maybe you're collecting and redistributing. So we saw a lot of the collection, and I showed you much less of, okay, but how is this spent? And maybe you collect here and you spend there. And those things are crucial, especially if we start thinking about things like, how happy am I with this? Of course, I'm gonna be less happy if I'm only paying and not seeing any benefits of this. So that's something that we're doing more recently of what about more quote unquote public goods? Of course, there's no like schools and hospitals back then, like as such, but am I getting roads built? Am I getting bridges built? Am I getting a postal system? So that's something that we're clearly working on. So again, to be very coarse and horrible, we just delete everything that is transfers and the results hold. If you delete anything that is transfers, that's also partially response to Alejandra. On the revenue side, on the spending side, on the gasto side, it's complicated. So we delete a lot of this Real Hacienda en Común. Of course, then the misreporting becomes a bit messy, but in general, we're trying to avoid double counting. And for this robustness check, we're trying to avoid, okay, what about if this is net of transfers? This is such a big topic that now, as I was kind of hinting at before, we're also very much thinking about more in the lines of Alejandra and Grafe of what about actually looking at all these transfers in a more like network model and all of that like fancy stuff that you can do now with networks. So just to say, this is a very important topic that is very much in our minds, and we can just say, oh, it's not that, and kind of like delete that from the paper, but something that we're thinking. It's also something that we're thinking, again, to Rui and to Alejandra's point, of heterogeneous effects of, okay, maybe this is actually a net receiver or not. So especially for the longer term, we want to see, okay, not only like, did you give a lot of money, but what was your net? So that's something that we very much have in mind. Before we potentially go back to Alejandra's point, let me not forget your other point on inequality. This is very much at the end of the day, despite the whole discussion that we had about transfers just now, the big view that David Mitch was saying. I mean, in a kind of like this empire that is probably more taking than giving. And even when it's giving defense to Cartagena from silver bullion from Potosí, as many people in the room have studied, Alejandra, but also people like Mauricio Drelichman, etc. So that's kind of like what we're thinking there. In terms of this being regressive and potentially looking at eventual inequality and stuff, I think we could. Obviously, back then it's going to be hard, but we could. But I don't want to completely, I mean, maybe just go back to Alejandra's point. I don't know, Pilar, you decide. And again, Giorgio is there. So Giorgio, just feel free to, if you want to comment or expand, etc.
Yeah, thank you very much. Alejandra, Nuno, if you don't mind to wait a couple of seconds because it's now time. So I would like to close the formal session. And before closing, I would like to remind you that next week on 13 April, we have the next seminar. It's Riding the Bubble or Taking for a Ride, Investors in the British Bicycle Mania by Will Quinn, the Queen's University Belfast, and Tom Turner, Queen's University Belfast. So thank you very much to everybody. We hope to see you next week. And now for those who wish to continue, we are going to start 15 minutes extra to continue the informal discussion. So thank you very much. And now, Alejandra, if it is fine, do you want me to unmute you so you can ask your question yourself? Is it fine?
Yes. I mean, everybody can read that.
Yeah. Do you want me to read it?
What do you want me to do? I can read it, or I can...
Go ahead, Alejandro. Just ask your question.
Okay. What that was? Well, some of the questions were already put, but are you hearing me well?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. So I was wondering, what was the fiscal base of the different districts? that they are not even, well, they might be even created in a staggered fashion as well. They were not all ab initio. That's something to account for. But also because these districts have very, very different set of endowments. You know, it's not the same to collect taxes in Zacatecas or Potosí than in Chiloé or Puno. And these are all districts that they are represented in your sample. So that would be interesting to qualify, or to assess by the different fiscal. Well, if there is a fiscal base that is common to all them, particularly because you insisted on the role of the direct taxation or quasi-direct taxation. The question about the intra-colonial transfers, you answered to Rui to some extent. It's a lot of acrobatic either to count them in or discount them all together. But also the carryovers, I guess as you've seen, we all have worked with that database, yeah? So it's like the n iteration of the same. But one first thing that came about when Tipaski and Klein published that was the way to account for the carryovers. And the carryovers increase, and proportionally in some places are even bigger than the sort of genuine revenue, as this decentralization, as you call it, increase with this sort of ill-defined big category. So how you deal with the carryovers. And finally, I think somebody made a question before about the sort of how you establish the estimate, how you establish the relative distance to what you call the big collecting centers, when with another organization we found that there were the net receivers and big receivers, yeah? Montevideo and Buenos Aires without the transfers would disappear from your numbers. So, well, if this is also a process that staggered, and if there are these big intra-colonial transfers that don't go to Spain, how you account for the change over time, yeah? And I wondered if you had any estimate in per capita terms.
I go? Okay. So yeah, so great questions. Some of them we discussed with Rui, but not all of them. So thanks a lot, Alejandra. I mean, obviously you're a big expert on this topic. So I would say in many things, like the bad answer is, oh, okay, like this caja was different than another one. So there would be kind of like a fixed effect by caja, but that's like a silly, simplistic econometric answer. I think the more serious econometric answer is, because of these differences, we very much also want to look at these heterogeneous effects. So it's different if it's a mining caja, quote unquote, than a port caja, quote unquote, or a mainly indigenous tribute caja, quote unquote. So that's why, I mean, again, I just flash you those results. But that's what we're looking at in the more heterogeneous effects, kind of like mechanisms of transmission. So very much to look at the heterogeneity. Okay, the reform works, but where does it work, in which areas, et cetera, et cetera. So very much a point that we take. You probably have worked on this more than anybody in the audience. The mess with carryovers, we try to like take care of them, delete them, don't delete them. I mean, as you know, like the double counting and stuff is a mess here. So try to like completely delete them, have a version where we keep them. I mean, of course, we try to like clean as much as possible. Is that enough? We don't know. So we can just delete everything that is not a carryover. And I don't know if Juan David, our other co-author, is here in the chat, and he's kind of like the expert of all of that data cleaning work. But that, as you well know, is one of like the crux of the matter again in the Tepaske data set. And again, I mean, the last question on distances and stuff, it's more related, and I would say even population. So now we don't have the per capita because we don't have population at that level of disaggregation or at that level of periodicity, I mean. So we have stuff of like near far, we have stuff of like high population, low population, but these are things that we do not have like the whole time series to be able to like say in a per capita basis, except in the modern time period. So very much things that we're thinking about. that we're trying to exploit also as heterogeneous effects to understand. I mean, I guess the contribution in this paper as your work is like to try to like look at the whole empire and have a more comprehensive view relative to like some of the more historical work like Lynch or other people's focusing on one or other viceroyalty. But of course, these are very different animals and something that we want to potentially, given your comments, bring more to light in the heterogeneous effect. But again, happy to continue chatting about this, and so glad that you were able to join. Thanks, Alejandra.
There was other question. Oh, no, it's fine, it's fine. So do you have any other question? No? I have one. I mean, it's more kind of comment, but indeed this, because your story is very much based on the role of intendancies, and because this is indeed a French institution, I would like to know if there is literature about the effect of this institution in the French case or also in the Spanish case, for instance, because in Spanish it was implemented at the same time as in Latin America, right? So what do we know in order to see the differences of the implementation of this specific institution?
Okay, so let me answer that. I also see actually in the chat, I think Nuno Palma had asked something. It just doesn't appear in the question box anymore. So maybe you want to go to him back again. So to answer to yours, yes, I mean, definitely. I mean, I think this is kind of like the intendancy system in the Americas. There is, I know, one work that modern and that is looking at this empirically for France. I'm not aware of Spain, to be honest. I mean, this is something that, again, we're always thinking kind of like the Spanish Empire and like look more at Latin America, but it's something that we haven't looked at yet. Maybe at least to get the references. I mean, I know that again, you work a lot on this. It would be interesting. I mean, I'll send you the reference of the few things that I have, but I think it will be something super interesting to look at. Of course, Spain has great data as well, so it might be interesting. Okay, I think that Nuno said that yes, it was answered by Giorgio. I think it was something on inflation, deflation, not deflated completely. Then we did some exercises just to show that like inflation is kind of stable in the few places where the cities have data, and something about like just keeping everything in, I think it's pesos de a ocho, which again, maybe Juan David can comment more on. But yeah, I think that it's been solved, quote unquote, or answered. No more open questions. I don't know if we're exactly on time or not. That's your job, Pilar.
Yeah, I have a last final very short question, and then I think it's time to finish. But the topic is really interesting. It was just I mean, because this happened at the same time that you have other Bourbon reforms. So as you have said, for instance, trade liberalization is not very clear for me to see how they interact. So because you increase trade, you have more taxes on that and so on. So maybe just showing, because you have showed the graphs of the different kind of taxes. So maybe just spending a little bit more of time on that could be as a basic conceptual clarification of the sources of this taxation, of, for instance, also with mining, because we know that there was a reduction on the tax on gold and silver taxation in the 18th century. It moved from 20% to 10%. So it was a tax reduction, but it was a huge increase, well, a big increase in tax collection because precious metal mining increased. So I think that's showing in a more clear way. These taxes maybe could help to understand these reform tendencies within the general Bourbon reforms.
Totally. I mean, absolutely take the point. And of course, if we're going to call the paper Bourbon reforms and then we just end up talking about 1/3 of them, totally. I mean, just to answer your question, but I mean, I'm embracing the point very much. The reorganization of the territories, the viceroyalty part, and again, I know I was running in a 40 minutes presentation. That's quite early, right? Like Nueva Granada and Rio La Plata. Then you have trade, which is closer to the time period. So that's something that we're looking at as well. I think there's something Alejandra is making some clarification in the chat, but anyways, you can all read it. That's a bit later, but it's 1750s, and that again is Ellingson's paper. This is almost the last part of that. I mean, the Bourbon reforms are decades in the making, right? So this is kind of the last part, but we need to be a bit more clear, maybe just have some timeline of when are things enacted. I showed you here and there, like, oh, it's not trade, but I didn't like give you the full structure or a better structure of like, okay, first is territorial reorganization, then it's trade, then it's tax reform. Of course, these things are like working in tandem. It's just that here, and that's where I think the nitty-gritty of the year and stuff helps a lot of, okay, but this is 83 and not 84, which is more with the intendants than with like the general trade measure. And I think Alejandra was saying the tax reduction, yeah, for the Pilar's comment, I think it was a comment on your comment, that was only for Peru and Bolivia. Obviously, that's correct. I think it's just information that she's adding here, not a question. Thanks a lot, Pilar, Alejandra, Rui, everyone. I mean, fantastic discussion, and sometimes even the time is short for a longish discussion, but I guess we need to finish on time.
So thank you very much. Thank you for these wonderful presentations, and see you next week. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Thanks. Ciao.